Welcome everyone. Would like to start. Let me start by saying that unfortunately Adriaan Geuze is not able to come. It's a family situation. He's very sorry because he was so much looking forward to meeting all the people here, but also discussing his work from a social science perspective. But we wish him and his family all the best for the coming days. So that's why he's not there. But the good news is that we have then more time to discuss a very interesting and important topic, the closure of the Weesperstraat. For the people from Amsterdam, this is like something to remember from the last summer, right? We heard about it all the time in the news. Many people were angry. I also recognized myself or realized that I was moving my oldest child to a new house that was close to a street that basically was the only entrance to the center. And easy car ride to that house was normally 10 minutes for me. It took now 90 minutes or more. And we had to do it more than once. So that was quite a challenge. But it was really interesting to see also in the local media how this was discussed and what exactly happened after that. So that particular event will be like the main topic for today. I want to say a few words about the background of this particular event. So I organized this together with Laura Dupin and Ming-Shu Wang. We are currently fellows at the Netherlands Institute for Advanced Studies. And we have a fellowship that tries to understand better the relationship between the built environment and the way in which people in the city organize, either in profit organizations or in non-profit organizations. We're about sort of ending this fellowship, and we have a very interesting large symposium, 3-day symposium at the Trippenhuis, where we invited experts from different disciplines, management and business, urban sociology, political science, to discuss from their perspective what it means, how the city sort of is designed and what that has an impact on in particular ways in their particular disciplines. We were also asked to do a public event. So this is the public event where we want to sort of reach out to a larger audience. And I think that today's topic really fits well in the larger context of the symposium, but because it's really about what happens if you change the infrastructure of the city, what happens to a city. And we are very happy that Jeroen Slot, who's head of research of the city of Amsterdam, will provide us with a lot of information. So they studied this before and after in different ways to see what are the effects of this closure. And that's exactly also what the topic of the symposium is about. So what happens if you change the design of the city in terms of the livability, the way that people perceive the city, the way that they use the space. So those are sort of the questions that we will have. After that, I really would like also our speakers of the symposium to react from their particular expertise, their discipline, places where they come from, how they look at an example like this from a very local example. But of course also the other people in the audience. I would be very curious to hear what you think of this particular event and how we should also see this in the larger question of the future of the city in terms of how much room can we give to cars and how much sort of can we find ways to design the city in better ways to make sure that for the future the city stays also livable. Deborah Minkoff will be the moderator. She's a professor of sociology at Barnard College, Columbia University. But before that, I give the floor to Jeroen Slot to explain a bit about the closure and the effects of that closure. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Floris, and thank you for having me here for the invitation. What the main part of my presentation is dedicated to the closure of the Weesperstraat. It's a very interesting experiment, and many of my colleagues said because it's an experiment, it can't fail. This is well, when an experiment is set up, then they're probably right. But many more things can be said about that. What I just want you to do is to look at the right-hand side of this slide, which presents a picture that I could have taken myself. But it definitely represents the situation as it was during the closure. And I know this for sure because our office at that time was the building that is just out of reach of this photo, but very close by. So it was, this experiment was in our front garden, you could say. But before I come to this main topic, I'd like to start with some introduction on the city of Amsterdam, because I realize that not all of you are very familiar with this well-known but also very small city. And if you're occupied with all kinds of daily things, whether it's The Hague politics, European politics, or you're angry because something happens in the city or in traffic or etc., you tend to forget that if you look at the city from a somewhat broader perspective and you look back a few decennia, you tend to forget that the last 40 years have been really more or less a success story. In 1985, this city had, after a long period of population decline, it had 650,000 inhabitants. And from 1985, the population started to grow again. And if you look back at it, at these 40 years, we have seen a successful city. And that's not specific for Amsterdam, because that's what happened to a lot of cities, not only in Europe but worldwide, in this period. And a lot of literature is available that gives answers to questions why this happens, how this happens, and a lot of literature that more specifically focus on the situation in Amsterdam, what was the change there, and what new challenges does this period of success inevitably brings with itself. So that's why I want to start with a short introduction. And if you look at this longer period of time, and you're probably familiar with Hans Rosling, who never got tired in making all kinds of statistics that prove that there was a lot of progress in the world. And if you make a few lookalikes, you could say, you can observe over the last decades at least some things that quite drastically improved, whether it's crime, whether it's the number of deaths in traffic in the city, or the number of murder and manslaughter in the city, and many more could be made. This is I saw some from the newspaper Het Parool, a local newspaper, a very good newspaper. But I think that the amount of time and space they dedicate to crime is the opposite from this trend. But that's fine. And if you look at other statistics, whether it's unemployment or labor market participation, you also see definitely quite impressive improvements in the city. But then if you look a bit closer at these 40 years, the last 10 years are a very specific period, a very specific edition, you could say, of this success story. And one of the ways to point at that phenomenon is to look at population. Population started to grow from 1985 onwards, but if you look at the speed of population growth, it doubled in the last 10 years. And what you can see from these two population pyramids is that, especially in these age groups, that's the people who fancy sitting at a terrace, I sometimes say, but it's the younger population where we see this specific growth over the last 10 years. And that means that the city's growth is not more of the same, but it's more and more selective over the years. That's one of the main characteristics of this longer period of time. It's not more of the same in terms of the average age of the population, but there's also another difference. This looks like the most boring slide ever. But I think still it has something very significant in it. What you can see is the darker blue line is the number of people who have not migrated from abroad to the city. And it's not a stable population, but in terms of numbers, it's very stable over the last 10 years. And there's also no difference in the darker green line that indicates the number of people who migrated to the city of Amsterdam from abroad, but longer than 10 years ago. But the significance of the slide is in the last line, the lighter green line. These are recent migrants, you could say, and their number doubled over the last 10 years almost, and population growth of the city has only taken place because of this in-migration from abroad, from different countries than happened in the 1980s and 90s, guest laborers, etc. So it's mostly it's Italy, it's France, it's Belgium, Germany, the UK, and some other countries that are responsible, you could say, for this population growth. And something else has changed. If you look at the educational levels, well, let me say one more thing about this lighter green line. If you look at, they're often called expats. And, well, people in Amsterdam have some buzzwords to indicate things that are not okay. It was dog shit. It was these how do you call them? These small baggage rolkoffers. Trolley connected to tourists, but now it's expats. That's why we no longer use the word and tend to look simply at the income levels of this group. And what you can observe if you look at the income of people in this group, then we see, especially in the top 20% of the Amsterdam incomes, growth is highest. And now it is even so that the average income within this top 20% for this group is higher than for all Amsterdammers together. And I do not tell this detail because I'm jealous or whatever other reason, but simply to indicate that the city has changed at a very rapid pace. And it also is connected to the kind of firms that are in the city as compared to, let's say, 10 or 20 years ago. Globalization, internationalization has gone very rapid. The university also is one of the reasons why this has happened. So it's important. But something else changed. If you look at the educational levels of people in the city of Amsterdam, the number of people with higher education has doubled in 20 years' time. And this is what Amsterdam and the Netherlands look like. We have two lines. The purple one is higher vocational level, and the blue one is academic level. And the right-hand slide, the right-hand part of the slide is indicating the levels in the Netherlands, and the left hand is the city of Amsterdam. And we observe quite strong differences. First of all, the lines are at a much higher level, but then also the vocational level and academic level are the other way around. And what we see in the city of Amsterdam, growth is only in the academic levels. So this is also one of the ways to indicate the selectiveness of this city growth process. Well then, the last 10 years were very specific. If people that come to the city are selected in whatever way, then you must expect that leaving the city is also selective. And what we have observed over the last 10 years, and remember that 2013, 2014 was the end of the global financial economic crisis. And from that moment on, the housing market started to boom again, and it hasn't stopped booming since. And what we see is that from 2013 onwards, we see an increasing number of people leaving the city. A different phase in their life cycle. When they get kids or want to have kids, they tend to choose a different place to live. And what we can also see, at least some of you can see from this figure, is that this group is preferring the richer southern part of the wider metropolitan region. And this is because they were selected, because they have a lot of cultural capital, they're promising talent, etc. But this is what happens, and this also indicates that what happens in Amsterdam will have sooner or later specific effects for a wider region. Well, obviously the city is attractive for a lot of people, and a lot of people even are successful in finding a place to stay in the city, and there's a reason for that. That is because Amsterdam is doing economically pretty well. The red bar is the city of Amsterdam. The other colors are other parts of the metropolitan region. And what we, especially for the last decade, observe is that economic growth is within the city of Amsterdam much higher than in the rest of the region, where it is higher than at the national level. So what we see is that the city is not only attractive, but it's doing economically well. And this is some information on job growth. Well, lonely at the top, you could say, on the right hand. Job growth is first and foremost is the highest in the city of Amsterdam. And if you look a bit more at the national level, then you can see that the western part of the country, and especially the larger cities in the western part of the country, are that's where you find the new jobs, and other parts, the rural parts in the other parts of the Netherlands, they not only face population decline, but also they face a decrease in the number of jobs. Well, that's fine. Let's go on like this. You could say, let's put another 10 years to this, but this obviously is this is not possible. You can't have 120% higher educated people in the city. You can't double it again. There's a lot of limits, and apart from the fact whether you would like a city like that, it's simply impossible. And it's also impossible because of this obvious reason. If everyone would live like an average Amsterdammer, we would need a bit more than 3 planets, and unfortunately we're still looking for a second. And so something has to change. This growth path, you could say, we have seen over decades is one way or another coming to an end. Well, this was a first part on just a little information on the city of Amsterdam. I also have prepared a few slides on one of the peculiarities of the city, all these bicycles. And it's true, there are a lot of bicycles in the city, and a lot of people use them. And this slide shows that if you look at the modal split, and note that this is not all people in the city, but the people who live here, not commuters, not tourists, not etc., then you can see that the bike has the largest share in this modal split, which is peculiar for the city, and it's interesting and funny, but also it needs a lot of policy to keep it this way. And if you look at the city and its districts, and look at the number of trips people make every day, and the share of these trips that are made on a bicycle, that's the information that is in this sheet. And you can observe two things. First of all, that in the well, the more central parts of the city, more trips are made. And the share that is made by bicycle declines when you get to the outskirts. What puzzles me, and maybe some of you as an answer, is this number of trips has declined over the last years. It had a sharp decline because of COVID, but it tends to decline. And this has probably to do with working from home. It probably has to do with the fact that you don't have to visit a bank or a shop or whatever, the internet, because this is not from trips that are made by people who work for firms, for example. But this is what happens. People are making less trips. And I'm very curious whether this is also true elsewhere, and where will it stop, and what are the causes or the consequences or the opportunities that come from this. But then if you ask, and we do a lot of surveys in the city, if you ask people who are using a bike, what do they think of traffic intensity? And what we then find is that a lot of people tend to find it busy or very busy, and even unsafe. Well, busy is not problematic in itself, but it is connected to perceived safety, etc. And if you realize that, bicycles are, well, there's a lot of bicycles there, but what's pretty new in bicycles, well, in the 1950s, everyone in the Netherlands had a black bike. You had a female version and a male version of it, and everybody was the same with his bike, but this has exploded. So everyone shows his identity through the bike he's riding, and the behavior in public space also connected to it. But one of the important changes is that we now have a lot of electric bikes. And we don't have the not only just a bike with a motor, but with an engine, but also these fat bikes, for example, that are, a new type of electric bikes. And all these different bikes have to use biking lanes and other roads together, and that when the population grows and traffic intensity grows, this leads to a new kind of friction. And that's what people answer, is we ask them questions like these. Are you feeling safe in relation to speed differences, especially connected to electric bikes, that both those who drive these electric bikes and others in majority tend to agree that this is a problem for the city? Well, I would almost say enough about bikes, but that's not true. One more slide. And this is really about safety. If you look at the number of casualties that come from traffic accidents, then there was this beautiful graph of declining traffic deaths. But then if you look at the number of people who are brought to emergency rooms because of bike, that's the left one for those of you who don't speak Dutch, then we see that 2,500 people were brought into emergency rooms because of an accident on their bike. And if you look at these numbers and see them in relation to the distance that they have driven on their bikes, then the difference with the number of people that ride cars and get to hospital is striking. Of course, the more severe accidents are often car-related, but still a lot of accidents happen, and those of you who are participating in Amsterdam traffic will definitely recognize this. Really, this was the last one on bikes. These different these different ideas and observations about where the city is going led to the conviction at the traffic department of the city of Amsterdam that something has to happen. And this is what they produced. They need there's a new approach needed. And this new approach, it's called Amsterdam Making Place. You could also say Amsterdam's kicking some people out. But that's the way it was presented. The left-hand bars show what happens if there is no policy at all. We'll see growth through all modalities of traffic. Also an increase of 28% of car traffic in the city. And that especially is the reason why there is a policy adopted of making space. And the idea is that if this becomes a rich policy, it should be possible to reduce this car growth to 7%. And in an environmental vision, some people look at that as the great ambition for the future. You would have no cars at all, at least no growth of car traffic at all in the future. What we do know is that traffic intensity now increases at a rate of somewhere like 1% per year. It doesn't look as very much, but if you do that for a few years, at certain parts of the city, you'll definitely find out that that will happen. What happened after the closure of the Weesperstraatknip? You'll have a mess in many ways. Well, and one of the initiatives, one of the policy initiatives, is to reduce maximum car speed. On the left hand, this is what the city is. Most cities in the world are 50 kilometers is the limit, and what has come into practice only a few months ago is that a large part of the city maximum speed is reduced to 30 kilometers, and they also promised that they'll start writing tickets from now on, I guess. So this will lead to a lot of discussion again. But this is the initiative. Only a few larger roads in the city there, still 50 kilometers is allowed. And they changed from this idea of looking at different target groups through their modality, a different policy for pedestrians, for bicycles, for cars, for etc. They now tend to look at it just from the point of view of speed. Three speeds in the city. One is 20 kilometers per hour for bicycles, 30 kilometers per hour for a different lane, and those bicycles or cyclists who want to go by 30 kilometers per hour speed are using the same lane as cars, for example. So simply, and then you have, of course, pedestrians who go at, let's say, 5 kilometers or are still there. And this policy has been in effect really for quite some time now, and in many incremental changes, you could say, you can see that the city is moving towards this different use of public space and different facilities for pedestrians and other users. There are many examples of it. And this is the reason why I wanted you to remember the photograph that I could have taken myself. This looks a bit like a British costume drama, but still, I can imagine why people choose a picture or encenate a picture like this on a sunny day to promote this project. Well, the temporary closure of one of the main corridors of the city. This was the experiment we are talking about, and it really is quite a different picture than what is the usual picture of the Weesperstraat, a 4-lane highway-like road in the city that comes very close to the city center. I started to say that it was an experiment, and experiments can't fail if you have thought about it a lot when you set up the experiment, and that's what they did. And they really did, if only because the project was postponed because of COVID. It was planned 3 years earlier, but they did really a lot of research on and modeling on what they could expect in terms of air quality, traffic flows, safety, and experiences from people that live in the neighborhoods that are affected by the experiment. And I think that this is, in this sense, it's definitely true that this experiment didn't fail. One, because it gave us a lot of information on what happens in the city and why it happens. And I can also tell you right now that always the devil is in the details, and there was a lot of devil in details in this case. If you look at this slide, you can easily imagine why some people say, well, it was successful. What we see in the dark purple area, that is the area very close to the road that was closed, we see a reduction of traffic of 18%. And also there's a reduction of traffic in the city center as a whole, and a reduction of traffic in the eastern part of the city. So, well, the experiment was set up to show that it is possible to reduce traffic and to give a certain policy way of looking at low-car policies. It is possible to reduce traffic. But then this idea of traffic reduction is not the only purpose. And what we can see from the right-hand side is that at some places in the city there was an increase of the number of unique vehicles that use the roads in the eastern part of the city. So you see a reduction at certain places and an increase at other places. And one of the things that was not predicted was that the southern part of the city ring also showed a decline in traffic, and many people expected that problems would come into existence there. And that is what not happened. In the eastern part, Ring Road showed some increase of traffic, but not very sharply. But there are many more things about this experiment that were measured and that are important lessons from this experiment. And one of the things, of course, is air pollution. The air quality changed during the closure experiment, during these 6 weeks. And what we can see is that what they measured a kind of background air pollution measure, and background means these are quiet places in the area close to the road. So you can think of quiet streets, but also parks and other places that are not busy places. It's a kind of background measure. And we've seen a significant decline of air pollution in that area. What is also not unsurprising, that is in the streets that faced increased traffic because of the closure, that the air pollution increased. And what can be shown is that in the streets with decreasing traffic, and that's not only the Weesperstraat itself, but also other streets close to this Weesperstraat, we see a decline of air pollution in these streets. Now, it's extremely difficult to assess what's the final conclusion. It's difficult to say whether the increase is more valuable than the decrease, etc. So that's still difficult. But what at least is clear from the data that air pollution is influenced. And then if we look at the right-hand part of the slide, we see that all kinds of traffic show decline, whether it's vans or trucks or personal cars, passenger cars from different parts of the city. All these different types of cars show a decline. And you probably already have seen the exception, and that are people with a foreign license plate. So tourists had some more problems. And it's one of the funny details of the research is that the municipality had to call Google every day because the closure was only till 11 in the evening. And for Google, you have to report a street closure every day again and again. So it's not surprising that this... but then the overall picture is quite clear. Well, also, when you look at results, you must expect some waterbed effects. The gains of one part are the loss of other parts, and that is what definitely came out of this this experiment as well. And because people have to choose different routes that are mostly longer and more traffic intensive, then the travel distance increases and also travel time increases, and that's what happened. What did not happen, at least what not showed in our statistics and in research, is that there were more public transport passengers or more cyclists. So there's no substitution or change of modality. And also park and ride facilities in the city were not used more often than in the time before the experiment. But then this is a slide on a lot of the details. What became clear is that there is, well, you can say there's traffic, but there's all kinds of different traffic. For example, emergency services, taxis, the logistics sector, waste collection. They had very much difficulty to, for example, general practitioners, midwives, etc., who were confronted with the closure and then not easily facilitated to find a different. In this information, there's a lot of lessons for the future, and you have to take care about accessibility for these parts of traffic. Maybe in percentage it's not very much, but it can be. You can have a lot of consequences if these people can't reach the place they are looking for. It's not surprising that hotels and bars report that they have less clients. They probably would have done so blindfolded. No, that's not nice. Well, in general, you could say, that it's interesting that 89% of the entrepreneurs in the region reported negative effects, and for some of them, these effects were quite obvious. If you look at the place where City Hall is, Waterloopplein, just after the cut, that place was extremely difficult to reach, and you can expect that some of the hotels and restaurants did see that in their business, and the city shops in general didn't report any differences as a consequence of this. And then we have residents. Well, here the picture is also not surprising, you could say. Residents who are living close to the Weesperstraat were quite positive about these experiments, whereas others in surrounding areas, and definitely at certain places, they protested and made loudly clear what they thought of the experiment and asked for a direct stop of the experiment. And there were some developments during the test, learning, because if you start an experiment, you need at least some time. That's for all traffic measures. You need some time for people. You allow for some time to adjust to a new situation. But what was underestimated was the waterbed effect and where it showed up. What was unexpected was the fierce resistance, and some of the newspapers, local media, they paid a lot of attention. They even interviewed people who were stuck in traffic, which led to a report that all Amsterdammers were against it, which is a classic baseline error, but never mind, you get good local TV. But some of it was definitely also very true problems for people who were living along these alternative routes. And then again, there's a lot of specific traffic in the street. It's very difficult for disabled people, for children who attend specific schools and are collected with buses, etc. So you have a lot of, you could say, traffic that is necessary in a different way than the large majority of traffic. So you have to be very, very precise and it takes a lot of collaboration with completely different groups. Even our own public health department was so much used to this easy access of their office. It's in the area that they forgot half of their cars to ask for a permission to drive out. So they had a lot of problems to do their work. Well, also internationally there was quite a lot of attention for this experiment, and I guess that the Guardian summed it up quite well. They simply quoted someone, which is one of the positions that, one of the fierce members of the opposition, you could say. This is called simply policy against cars. But that it did split up, that probably in more or less is the case in the city. So it's a real battle of interest, you could say. And so this is, it's really testing the tolerance of different people in the city with different interests, finding a solution that's fit for the future. And this combination is not so good, you could say. Cars and trees in many respects, but people who are fond of cars, are different people than people who are fond of trees and etc. And it's a bit of a shortcut, but there's definitely some truth in it, you could say. And I made this slide because there was, during the European election a few weeks ago, there was also a local referendum. And we've had a referendum before in the city. And you can see from the newspaper clippings that it was quite some time ago. It was 1992. There was no internet. CNN existed for 3 months, and they were present with a car at the Rembrandtplein, where the outcome of the referendum was presented. And one of the funny things is that this is, you could say, the start of low traffic policies. And the funny thing is that there was quite some debate in the city, but there was a lot of misinterpretation of what this referendum really meant. So some people said, well, I won, and the others said, I won, and they had a completely different view on this topic of low car policies. Well, this is often the case with politicians, but in this case it was quite extreme. And we had a referendum on land use, on the local government has as a priority to rigorously green the city. There should be more green in the city, and they made a policy proposal to do that. But this proposal also had some exceptions, for example, because houses have to be built within the city area. So it's not a very rigid, rigid policy proposal. And some people in the city thought this would be a good issue to have a referendum on. One of the differences between this 1992 referendum and the referendum from 2 weeks ago is that there was hardly any debate at all on the issue, and many people were quite uninformed, and only local newspapers, local media informed people on what was at stake at this referendum. And of course there was some issue on the English translation of the referendum question, but most people didn't know about the referendum and made a decision, if they made one, just on some, hardly informed, I would guess. But then, why I'm telling? Because we asked people.
How many?
Just a representative sample of some 1,100. So, well, maybe things have changed in the day before the election or whatever, but I guess many people were hardly informed and just made a decision on gut feeling or whatever. But never mind. The issue is important enough on how these two prospective traffic cars and how green can a city be, because that is definitely very important. And why I'm telling you this is that we made a new map of the city through one of the most traditional statistics we have, land use. And we, in a new way, try to find out what the city looks like. Unfortunately, this slide is in Dutch, but take away that 80% of space within the city limits is public space. 20% is private space. And you can easily guess from the color blue that a large part is water, but this is probably more helpful. What we have in the city is a lot of different green areas. We have agricultural land, for example. We have city parks that are much more recreative. We have very small pieces of green within neighborhoods, and we also have, well, nature-like areas within the city. And if you want a debate on this, this is very interesting to have. It's, for example, interesting that we have 15% roads and only, 10% of housing and other buildings within the confinement of the walls. But then there's a lot of space that we use as road, and the way we use it. Sorry? For instance, for bicycles, but mostly it looks like this grey area, grey surface that it is used for. And that space, how to use that space, is an interesting topic to discuss. And it's not a surprise that we find more green space at the outskirts of the city. In the city center, you find very limited green areas, and at the city outskirts you find a lot of it, you could say. But one of the interesting things is that why this rigorous greening of the city? Because of climate adaptation, because of biodiversity, but also because of recreational purpose for people. Mental stress, places to meet, etc. And the funny thing is, or not funny, if you look at the places where there's a lot of green, you find the highest rates of obesitas, the largest number of people who are not exercising enough. They are using parks at a less high level than others do. So greening in itself doesn't make a difference for if you don't look at human behavior. And this is one of the interesting questions we face, not only how to use land, but how to make it interesting and worthwhile for people, and also helping in terms of stress, for example. Because what we do know is that the density in the city will only grow and not decline, at least not for the next years to come. And then if we look at what happens, if you look at the green changes in the surface that is called green, then you can see that in the city center there's increase in green places, and at the outskirts there's decrease. And this is a bit of a slide that doesn't show that the percentage of growth in the city center is just as high as the decline in another part, but the number of hectares that is underlying is quite different. So if you try to find out, also in terms of investment, what are the costs of making one more hectare of green space in the city center? What could it do if you improved the green space you have in other parts of the city? So that's an interesting question, and I think that this also relates to the question, how should we use public space in the future? And how it is used is also related, of course, to politics. And I guess that we've seen a lot of trends happening to the city that come from the world or from Brussels or from whatever, all kinds of trends that are very difficult to influence. But two things can be influenced: the way we look at public space and how we use it, and the way we look at public services, facilities. That probably is one of the ways that are open to shape the city in the way the people of the city collectively decide to want for the future. But then you have to decide on what this ambition for the years to come will be. And if we look at the political landscape, we also observe that there is a lot of fragmentation. There are many more parties represented in the city council. The people that are in the city council are doing that for a declining number of years. There's a lot of changes through one period, for example. And what we see is that we find a stronger association between two groups of people. Roughly, you can say on the one axis, it's people who are, that's the upper part, people who think that the Netherlands is moving into the right direction, and at the lower part, the Netherlands is moving in the wrong direction. And on the horizontal axis, we have people on the right hand that are more satisfied with their own lives, and people that are less satisfied with their own lives. And what we see is that there is a clear association between voters for insider political parties, you could say, political parties that have been long in existence, etc., and other parties that have come only a few years ago into existence, where volatility is much higher than in the other part. And there's also, you can observe a spatial distribution of these groups. And what we do know is that the share of voters that votes for one of these outsider political parties, be it on the left side or the right side, and the right side is less represented in the city of Amsterdam, but the number of voters for that kind of political parties is growing. And all these things together, the definite end of the growth path we've seen for the last decades, the challenges and environmental challenges we have, and all the difficulties we have on how to decide on what kind of future we want, they together are an enormous challenge, but probably not too difficult for you. Thank you.
Thank you. That was wonderful and provocative. And I have a bunch of questions, but I think my job is to turn it over to the audience so that you can take some of these questions. But I'll just note that as somebody who's interested in protest and social movements, what I find interesting is the question that's not answered in all of the wonderful data you presented, and you don't have to answer it here, but to think about who are the people who were protesting the closure, how might that come forward in terms of political parties and political platforms, but to think about who also might have been affected but didn't have a voice at the time. Because you tell this incredible story about the increasing income and educational levels of Amsterdam residents, especially, I think, in these more desirable neighborhoods. And you can see how well-resourced people will mobilize and protest against the disadvantages of this street closure, or even the shutting down of the streets or lowering the number of cars. And in my understanding and experience of, granted, New York City, which is quite a different place, the louder voices are the more privileged voices, and the folks who are most affected are the taxi drivers, the transport drivers, the people who have to drive long distances to begin with because they can't afford to live in the city, and then you add layers of barriers to entry to the city. So I'm just curious about that, and that's in the spirit of not so much asking you to respond, because I don't know that you have the data, but in the spirit of Floris asking those of us who have been here for the last couple of days with different backgrounds to respond to your talk from that perspective. I'm just going to put that on the table. I don't know where are you most comfortable?
Well,
yeah, so the problem, as I understand it, is that the Zoom audience needs everybody to be at a mic. So if you wanted to take a moment for that, I will then call on some of my colleagues and some of the visitors to this event.
Well, just to start with the last, we didn't speak a lot about people coming from outside the city to the city to do their job. And one of the lessons learned from this experiment is that we shouldn't one of the ways you could look at it is just put a barrier around the city, be it financial or in other ways. It could easily be done, you could say. That would not be very helpful, and it would affect some people much more than others. And one of the lessons of this research is that Amsterdammers themselves are a big part of the problem. Using cars, using routes that are not necessary, you could say. But there's a lot in behavior and in modal split that Amsterdammers themselves could change. And the first part of your question was about, well, who are these people whose voices are heard over loudly or are not heard at all? I think that at least there is some interest groups, some people who are just beforehand are against any measures that are, in their view, threatening for their businesses, etc. Or people who simply like their car and think of all measures that are against the car, that they are against that, even if they never visit the city center in their cars. Then there's also a group that was heard only because of their experience with the experiment. So the people who lived in the neighborhoods that faced increase of traffic, that was, you could say, genuine, was spontaneous in many ways, and they definitely wanted to be heard. And then there's probably this third group of, well, we specified quite a lot of different parts of traffic that are interesting, but we didn't look too much at different population groups, the taxi drivers, etc., who can be affected through these measures. But this is also a reason, I think, to have a debate on all these devilish details that are connected to this question: how to use public space and who's the public.
Thank you. Can I hand the mic to anyone with a comment or a question? I see a few. I'll start with my colleague Martin. Oh, right. I forgot you're doing that. Great. I'm going to then. I had to do it earlier, so I'm well trained. Thank you.
Thanks for a great discussion. It's an interesting experiment in making space, which I might define as kind of excluding certain modes of transport entirely from certain sections of the city. The other kind of policy interventions might be making safe and making place. Where making safe is getting folks to wear bike helmets, try and reduce those deaths, or making place, which is acknowledging that these modes of transport coexist in certain areas, but they have to use dedicated bike lanes, for instance. Or if you're in Paris, you have kind of a dedicated buffer zone between the bike lane and where the vehicles are. Were these other policy options on the table? What were the politics that led to the implementation? And do you think the city would do it differently the next time around?
Well, I think that the broader goal of these policies has been more or less the same over the last 15 or 20 years, or maybe even a bit longer. And there has been a lot of incremental change and ways to change public space to accommodate traffic and to make a choice against cars and for pedestrians and cyclists. But I think that, well, if you reduce this problem of how to use public space to a traffic problem, to a kind of technical problem, then this reduction is, I think, in itself a danger in the sense that maybe you won't see solutions that are more important. Traffic safety, accessibility, reachability, they're all important things, but the wider problem is, how do people meet? Different people meet in the city. How are opportunities for different people? That's the bigger question. If you reduce yourself or your policies to this traffic problem, it's a bit like rearranging deck chairs on, etc. So that's, I think, how are these two connected? Knowing that we can't influence the housing market, at least not in the short term. And what can we do about public services, public facilities? What can we do about? That's probably one of the big questions for the next 10 or I don't know how many years.
I think Christophe has a comment. I'm going to ask those of us who were participating in the NIAS conference to perhaps introduce ourselves. So it was Martin Roof from Duke University, sociologist by training, and Seoul, I believe. So, and then, of course, those of you who are in the audience as well, if you feel like you want to introduce yourselves, that's also would be great to know who's asking or commenting. Thanks.
So in that spirit, my name is Christophe Brandner. I'm also a sociologist, and I studied at UM Lyon and work at UM Lyon in France. And I'm originally from Austria, and so I wanted to report on one more street that had low traffic or no traffic in Vienna since 2015. And so the symposium that Floris introduced, I mentioned in the beginning during the introduction, is on the relationship between the built environment and entrepreneurs. And so, just like in your case, the people who were most upset about the fact that there was no more traffic in what was before sort of an eternal traffic jam were the business owners that were along the street, because they thought they basically would have to close down because they wouldn't get any foot traffic anymore, or any car traffic. And what really happened is that this is one of the most successful shopping streets in the country now, and it's largely credited to the fact that there are no cars anymore. So, a question related to this is to what Thank you. So the related question I have is to what extent you look to other cities in making your decision and in deciding how to implement the street closure in your case. Because the title of the panel is the future of planning, I think. And in the future of planning, to some extent, also lies increasingly in looking to what other cities are doing and learning from each other. So I'm curious if you have some reflections on that.
Wow. Well, there are quite a lot of examples of experiments with public space, especially related to traffic and cars, all over Europe. And this Vienna example is one of the well-known examples. But you can find them in Antwerp, in closer by cities, you could say. And people are exchanging a lot of information. That's what definitely happens. And what also is, but I'm not sure whether that is because we speak to all these attendants of international conferences on this theme, is what they, most of them say is that, well, at first all these changes find a lot of opposition, and when the change is done and we had some time to adjust, then everybody is happy with it, which is a bit like a new metro line in a city which faces a lot of opposition, and when it's there, everyone is using it and glad that it's there. But I'm not too sure whether that's because of the same baseline error I referred to before, because it's these planners themselves congratulating themselves that once this job is done, people will be happy with us. But it's definitely true that all change faces opposition, and especially, for example, you named the entrepreneurs. A lot of business in the city center is connected to tourism, and people are looking for ways to facilitate this kind of business. And I think I often thought, well, what would happen to a street if you would ban cars altogether? You facilitate tourists. Look at Weesperstraat, for example. There are other examples of the Haarlemmerdijk, which is still a kind of mix. But I think that in that sense, to see cars as completely objective, how do you call it, objective? That I think is also not a very good idea. You need transport. Mobility is very important for people, and depending on different groups in different age groups, different people, you need different ways to communicate, not only but also to be mobile. That's what I think.
So, Jeroen, thank you very much. You're a civil servant, so... okay, that's good. Because I want to ask you a question about how you look at local politics. And you seem to suggest in your slides that you're a bit disappointed by the fact that we do not have this political debate anymore about such an important issue, right? And in that sense, you can say, well, the experiment is not failed because we did increase a lot of discussion. I mean, it was very negative, I would say, mostly, especially in local media. How would you, with your experience of sort of decades in local government, how would you sort of see how local politics can take this issue up more, especially in a city which has a very progressive political landscape, right? So the Greens are the biggest party. I mean, they're now together with the Labour Party. But so you can say on that side, even though you show here that there are parts in Amsterdam that they might not have such a support, in the center, in the south, they have huge support. But apparently they are not able to really go beyond such an experiment where they basically were also, I felt at least, that would be my idea, that local politicians were not able to take this experiment, explain to the people in Amsterdam why it's so important to have this, right? So it was only about where are the problems and how to deal with that.
In many ways, I agree with you. The topic is interesting enough. What we have seen in this one experiment is just one small part of the larger problem. And I think it's true that many people are not only affected but also interested in this subject. But then you need to take time. You need enough time and I would say civil debate, leaving a lot of space for local initiatives, neighborhood initiatives, on how things can be done different. And from there have I would say, an atmosphere of changing together and making use of experiences of people in different neighborhoods in a way not to make it too political. Only political in the sense that in the end, this local government is the one who has to decide on many things, on finance, on other things. But if you I would say take it away from ideology, or at least present it as a case that is important for the future city, for all people. Different people, different political views. And that would be a way to find solutions. But it's difficult, it takes time, it takes a lot of information, good quality information that's trustworthy, etc., transparent. But then I would say it's a brilliant topic. And well, from New York we have the experience that the number of lawyers per square kilometer is a interesting, and I think Central Park was closed for demonstrations, but not for opera visitors with champagne glasses and needle shoot. That's the kind of, if you frame it in this way, or try to stop the debate because you take a very solid point of view, then well, discussion is gone. But how to do it?
Hi, thank you. I'm John Bannister. I'm editor-in-chief of a journal called Urban Studies, which is a home for research on urban areas around the world. It was fantastic listening to your great presentation. Great job you've got, research. But your presentation, the narrative through your presentation, I could say that I've seen this 1,000 times. So, the wealthy and prosperous people of the city left because there was high crime, because there was pollution, because there was all these negative things. They moved out of the city. And then crime falls, cultural services get redeveloped in the city centre, pollution drops, and so the prosperous move into the city centre. So this is happening in many cities all around the world. Then one of your slides was Amsterdam, we require 3.25 quarter planets, whatever, this is the way that we're going to... Well, this is the story in the developed world. So you've identified a fact we can't deny: the climate crisis. We can't deny our overuse of resources. These are facts. And the problem is then, how do we deal with it? And I think the key thing is why people moved to the city centre, because they wanted to spend less time travelling. They wanted better environmental facilities. They wanted closer access to services. And so then you have your disgruntled population. And the disgruntled population are spending more time. They're spending more resource. They get the worst part of the deal. And the solution has to be unique to Amsterdam. You can't, Amsterdam with its canals and beautiful architecture is completely different to a New York. So the solution has to be unique, but the solution rests in this slide here, that if you understand why people of power moved to certain places, then you understand why other people are upset, and your solution has to be about generating that equality. And I think that's the story, and that's the challenge.
Well, I could have done my presentation in 3 minutes. But this is very, very, very true, I think. But it also relates to empathy, you could say. Are people still willing to listen to each other and to understand what a life looks like from a less wealthy position, or from a newly arrival position, or etc.? And you need... I still think that public space and public facilities play an important role. Housing probably is already a bit more difficult. But what people in the city really share is this public space, and we have a lot of it. And we can use it, well, it's our public space. So there are ideas about how to use space and facilities collectively is, I think, an important question for the future.
Laura and Nicole had, or no, Nicole, did you want, and then we'll take one more academic question.
Okay, hi. Thank you. That was a very interesting presentation. I'm Nicole Marwell. I'm from the University of Chicago. And my question, I study politics and governance. And my question for you, and you'll forgive me, as a civil servant, I mean, you had to know when you did this that you were going to get big, outsized reactions. You used the word experiment. And I wonder... how is the thinking inside your agency? We did this to see who would get upset and how. And then to make that a sort of crisis to which you could then think about potential responses that would address maybe some of the things that John is talking about, and identifying who is most negatively affected by this, so that you could have a sort of crystallization of how to think it through moving forward. So I wonder if you could respond.
Well, I think the experiment was set up only for good reasons. There was no idea of, if we do this and we provocate that and we'll have this kind of... That it was not. What I think was underestimated, and that's mostly the case with things you must expect most. It was, again, underestimated that this experiment could be easily framed in a very specific way. It could be... It was underestimated that certain vested interests were against experiments like these. And then on top of it, and used by these two groups, was the genuine protest, I would say, from people who looked outside and said, oh, what's happening here? And so this is what was underestimated, again, and lessons can be learned from that, I guess. But also, in many ways, the experiment led to new insights, what's the quality of modeling of traffic, etc. So there's a lot of good results from the experiments, and it was by no way playing a game with the sentiment of people in Amsterdam or whatever. But this, on the one hand, underestimation, and on the other hand, not expecting difficulties like all these specific kinds of traffic and specific streets, and not being able to respond what they were able to respond during the experiment, but not convincingly enough. So that's also one of the lessons learned. And I think there won't be a second experiment like this, but there will definitely be others.
Okay, thank you very much for the presentation. My name is Filippo Weitzel from USI in Switzerland.
Oh, turn it on. I'm sorry.
You heard me, right? What I said, okay.
People on Zoom.
So I thought you heard too many sociologists speaking, so here is a management professor thinking in much simpler terms. I'm thinking about cost and benefits here, right? So my angle into this will be as simple as that. And when I look at the map of the traffic, it seems that just people redistributed themselves in different ways over the highways and the streets. In other words, you hit the cost bottom. You wanted to increase the cost of these people, but you didn't get there. The costs were not big enough to create so much complexity to give up the car. So my first reaction is, in terms of behavioral economics, you lean towards the cost, but you didn't make the cost enough high to give up the car. So not doing one street block, but maybe 2 or 3 would have been the solution, or going for 6, 8 weeks, 10 weeks of longer experiment would have made changing the habits of people. Because cars, yes, are a symbol in many ways, but they're habit in first and foremost. So I wonder if you thought about that on the cost side, but also especially if you thought about the incentive side as well, because there's a lot of work in behavioral economics talking about nudging and influencing instead of the cost, the benefits. So with respect to incentives to public transportation and giving up cars.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Well, to start with the last, the nudging, there has been a lot of nudging over the last years, trying in an incremental way to change accessibility, for example, the number of parking places, etc. So this has been done, and I think it's a refreshing way of looking at the problem, just as costs and benefits. But I think one of the problems is if you play too hard this cost card, you'll have protests, and a lot of protests in the same way when rents go up or whatever. And if you see how many public debate there is, well, if you park your car in the city center, you pay €7 per hour or so, and that's called idiotic by many people, but it helps. It definitely helps. But the elasticity of price rises, there's an end to that also. But if you look at the permits of people who live in the city and have a car, they hardly pay a lot of money to have this permit. So that would be a way of nudging or more. And also problematic is that part of the costs are for people who are not owning the cars or driving through the streets. That's also problematic. Air pollution, for example, if you drive back to your suburb, etc., is less affecting you than others. So I do think it's an interesting way, and often people think about how far can you go. But yeah, it's also a debate on what kind of functions we want in the city centre. Because speaking in terms of costs, those who are tourists and come from far are willing to pay €150 for a hotel room. If you, through this strategy, end up with only that kind of functions in a city centre, that's also the capital of the country, then something else is lost. So it's a interesting instrument, and it should be but it should be used with care.
I'm a non-academic, and as this is a public event, I like to grab the opportunity, because I've never had such a crystal clear idea about the city I live in, thanks to your presentation. But it also brings me to a subject that's related to it, and that I'm very much interested in. Is we are talking about how to use our public space. But if you look at the last municipality elections, we had, I think, a 51% turnout. So this is a serious issue, I think. If we should think about how we, as people who live here, think about the use of public space, I think this is a serious question, if the turnout. And also here, you use from the parliamentary elections, and the parliamentary elections, the turnout is higher. I think it's about 65%. So that's a little bit different. So I think one of the issues that Amsterdam has is the low turnout. And the second is that you said that the increase of people from outside what we called expats. I understood that. I'm not allowed to use this word anymore because it's a negative approach. But let's make it clear. Do you have also data on how are these people participating in the decision-making process? Because is it related to the low turnout of the municipality election by reaching also these people or including these people?
Interesting questions, but just to start from this, well, a low turnout is not necessarily bad, but it's often problematic. And, well, I kind of presented a success story of the city, but one of the things the city failed, but turnout from these first wave of immigrants has not changed over the decades. It's somewhere between, I would say, 35%. What has changed is that there are specific political parties targeting on this group. This hasn't changed turnout, but it has changed the preference of these people. But still, turnout is low and participation rates are low, and they are an important group and a large group in the city. So that's one of the challenges, how to get them into this debate with their specific preferences. Then we have those recent migrants. We don't have much data on it. The participation of this recently migrated group probably is quite low. We're not too sure about it, but examples from Brussels show that this is quite low, this participation. And that's difficult. The first question is, how motivated will this group be to participate? Because a lot of them at least think they will stay only for a few years. So why participate? So but these are two important questions. And if we have a larger group that is not participating, some commitment there should be from people who are living in the city in one way or another. So it's two difficult questions, but interesting.
So I'm afraid that I have the now difficult task of saying that we've reached the end of our time for questions. So I apologize on behalf of all of my academic colleagues that we used up all the space or much of the space. But we do have the room for the next half hour, and there are drinks available, I've been told. So it's an opportunity to ask more questions one-on-one of anybody who's asked a question, or our esteemed speaker, who I want to thank for really a great presentation, a lot of generative kinds of topics that came up. And I want to thank all of you for joining us tonight. And again, apologies for not allowing for more questions from the audience.